The UN says Sudan is a crisis of staggering scale and cruelty that demands urgent attention. The conflict has killed tens of thousands of people and displaced 12 million. Joe Biden's pushing for a ceasefire, but what can he realistically achieve in the 4 weeks before Donald Trump takes office? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Fighting between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary rapid support forces is escalating in North Darfur. The regional capital Al-Fashir has seen intense battles in the past week, and there's no respite in other parts of the country. Both the army and the paramilitary group deny deliberately attacking civilians. So what will it take to get the two generals to the negotiating table? And is the US willing to take decisive action against foreign powers fueling the conflict? We'll get to these issues in a moment with our panel of guests, but first this report from Wilson Dysart.
500,000 people, forced from their homes by 20 months of conflict in Sudan, have sought shelter here. This is Zam Zam refugee camp in North Darfur state, near the regional capital of Al-Fashir. There, soldiers and paramilitary fighters are locked in brutal battles for control. The Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, has laid siege to the city since May and is holding the line against the army. The violence has killed at least 780 civilians, attacks that may amount to war crimes, the UN says.
This alarming situation cannot continue. The Rapid Support Forces must end this horrible siege, and I urge all parties to the conflict to stop attacks on civilians and civilian objects. I call on them to comply with their obligations and commitments under international law.
Al-Fashir has seen some of the heaviest fighting, and aid workers have been caught in the crossfire. On Friday, 3 World Food Program employees were killed. Despite efforts by the UN and other humanitarian organizations, medicine and food are in short supply.
There is a lot of hardship and suffering in this place. One of the things people here are eating is ombas, the waste left over after pressing the oil from peanut shells, which is a type of animal feed. After they extract the oil, we take the ombas. Here it is.
This week, the U.S. announced another $200 million in humanitarian assistance and repeated international calls for a ceasefire. In an address to the UN Security Council, Secretary of State Antony Blinken urged what he called foreign sponsors to stop sending drones and missiles to Sudan.
Outside actors are arming and supporting both parties, turning an internal power struggle into a conflict with global dimensions. In short, failure to act in Sudan threatens the peace and security that this council is charged with preserving.
The U.S. is investigating whether the United Arab Emirates is supplying American-made weapons to the RSF. U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East and North Africa, Brett McGurk, told the Senate that the UAE has made assurances it isn't arming the RSF and will not do so going forward. The findings of the investigation are due to be released 3 days before President-elect Donald Trump takes office in January. During his previous term, Trump had a more comfortable relationship with the UAE than Biden has had, and it will be up to him to put the report's recommendations into action. Wilson Dysart, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's discuss all this now with our panel of guests today. Joining us from Cairo is Dallia Abdelmoniem, a Sudanese political analyst and commentator. In Boston, Massachusetts, Alex Duval, the executive director of the World Peace Foundation. He specialises in peace building in Sudan. And in London, Kholood Khair, the founding director of Confluence Advisory, a think tank formerly based in Khartoum. Thank you very much for joining us all on today's programme. Kholood, if I can start with you, it's raged, this war, for over 20 months. The horrendous human toll is still growing. Nothing is improving. It's looking really, really grim. Is that your assessment?
Yes, and it's quite understandable given the circumstances that nothing is improving. We haven't seen any real alacrity by the international powers to improve the situation in Sudan. There have been countless meetings, countless mediation and countless meetings at the UN Security Council that have all come to naught. And that's because while Sudan has been gaining attention over the past 20 months in policy circles and in media houses, there just hasn't been any concrete action that international actors have had to commit to. And that sends a very clear signal to the belligerent parties in Sudan that actually the international community isn't interested in seriously seeking a resolution. And so what we've had is a proliferation of the conflict. We've had more battlefield front lines over the past 20 months than initially were. We've had an arms race over the summer, which has seen more sophisticated and just a larger volume of weaponry coming through. And in all of this, civilians have borne the brunt of the violence.
Alex, let's have a look at the state of the battlefield right now. We look at a map here and you can see this vast country. It's not cleanly sliced into two. There are two areas and then there are intertwined tentacles that stretch out across the map. What's your view of who's got the upper hand? It seems perhaps the Sudanese armed forces have been making more gains in recent months.
Certainly, I think it's the case that on several of the key battlefronts, the Sudan armed forces tactically have the upper hand, but I don't think anyone expects a decisive strategic advantage from either side. And if I could add to what Kholood has just said, the most lethal weapon in this war is the very rudimentary age-old weapon of hunger. And just this week, the UN-accredited Famine Review Committee has been meeting. Its report is due any day now. And I fear what we will learn from that is what we all know in our hearts, which is that famine that was identified, declared some 5 months ago, will have spread, will have intensified, and likely the death toll will be escalating, not from the tens of thousands, but into the hundreds of thousands due to hunger and disease.
Dallia, if we've got a situation which perhaps isn't completely stalemate, but is not moving that much, that is a recipe for disaster, isn't it, in terms of the death toll? It just means this goes on and on.
Absolutely. The fact that there's not much push to find an end to this war or a push to bring both parties to the table will just, extend this war, further. We're creeping into the 2 years now, coming up in April. And the numbers keep escalating. There is hunger in Bahri, North Khartoum. There is hunger in several areas in Sudan. And the hunger is being, famine and food is being used as a weapon by both sides. And that's something that people don't want to admit nor acknowledge, but that's what's happening. And the longer this goes on, the worse the catastrophe it is that's unfolding in Sudan.
Kholood, we're going to zoom in now on Darfur, one of the worst places in the country. A new report by the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, 783 civilians have been killed, more than 1,143 injured. Knowing UN reports, that's probably an undercount. How bad is it in Darfur?
I think it's a massive undercount. I mean, we're hearing reports of, hundreds of thousands of people fleeing from Darfur, fleeing from Al-Fasher, going into Zam Zam Camp and some of the other camps as well, Abu Shok, etc. We're seeing that there are hundreds of thousands who are leaving from Al-Fasher going into Tawila, another part of sort of North Darfur to the south. And the amount of violence we have seen over the past sort of almost a year shows us that actually the numbers across the board are an underestimation. The number of people suffering from famine in Zam Zam Camp are likely to be also an underestimation. There definitely are severe undercounts for the number of people who are dying. We know that there has been a siege on Zam Zam for the better part of a year. We know that food stocks, water supplies are being cut off from people. We know that there are raids that are happening in some of these camps. We know that the RSF has provided a pretext for its invasion of Zam Zam by saying that there are armed combatants in there, not just civilians. And
okay, let me just interrupt you for a second. Zam Zam is a camp of displaced people that's been there for a very long time. How many people do you think are in that camp? And do you think that camp, in fact, the whole of Al-Fasher, which is, this camp is about 15 kilometres south of Al-Fasher, could that fall? And as a result, what then would be the result of that?
Well, we're looking at around over 3 million people in the greater area who have been moving around from one part to the other, trying to escape the violence. And what we're seeing now is that the slow assault caused by the besiegement of the RSF of the Greater Al Fashir area, it will likely come to a head around Christmas time, where the RSF know that the international community's attentions are elsewhere, that people have powered down for the year for the Christmas holidays. And that is when we expect to see an uptick in violence, particularly in Zam Zam Camp. And there have been enough warning signs and enough sort of the blaring of klaxons by rights groups, by observers. But unfortunately, we haven't seen the required attention from the international community to try and get ahead of or preempt or stop some of these attacks. We know that when the RSF takes over parts of Darfur, atrocity crimes often follow. We saw it in Jenaina, we saw it in Ardamata in West Darfur. So this is almost a certainty. It plays into the logic of the RSF there, and yet very little engagement. So if the UN is worried about 700 people dying, it will soon have a lot more of a sort of numbers of fatalities on its hands.
Dallia, I mean, those many believe are war crimes that have taken place, but the other side, the Sudanese armed forces, they're also being accused of war crimes. I'll give you an example again in Darfur on the 10th of December, when apparently they carried out an airstrike in Kabia, which is about 180 kilometres west of Al Fashir, on a market day. So lots of people were there in the centre of town, and more than 100 people were killed. We can't just focus on one side, can we?
No, we can't, and we shouldn't. However, the indiscriminate bombings, aerial bombings, carried out by the Sudanese armed forces it's an atrocity. But at the same time, what the RSF has done has gone up beyond what anyone can even imagine. The sexual violations reports that are coming out of Al Jazeera, for example, and from Kordofan, are just horrific. Same thing, they're not allowing civilians to leave. They're besieging civilians from leaving from the areas that they control to go into other areas. So the violations are committed by both. But if you're going to scale it, then what the RSF has committed is far worse than what the army has been doing. But if you ask any Sudanese, they will always point to the RSF as to what they're doing is just, it's genocidal in some cases, especially in regards to Darfur and El Jenaina, war crimes, ethnically driven, massacres. Like in Jenaina alone, more than 15,000 people were killed, massacred by the RSF. That does not mean Saf is an innocent bystander, but in comparison, the RSF, is on a different level.
Alex, if we focus on Darfur, the international community is doing nothing, but actually there are mechanisms from the UN Security Council on Darfur, not for the rest of Sudan, that are in place. There is an arms embargo that covers Darfur, put in place years ago and renewed, and a sanctions mechanism. Why are they not using these?
The UN Security Council has been extraordinarily timid. And I could mention a whole raft of other resolutions mechanisms. There's Resolution 2417 on armed conflict and hunger that obliges the UN Secretary General to act swiftly when armed conflict is threatening famine, as is happening in Darfur today. None of these are being utilized, and it's partly due to weak leadership at the United Nations. It's also due to the feeble response of the African Union, which is a shadow of its former self. And in a couple of months, the African Union is going to be electing new leaders for the Commission. And we hope very much that whoever takes over the file at the African Union will become energized and committed and will push through the types of resolutions, measures, initiatives that could unblock the impasse of the UN Security Council. Because if Africa takes a united position, it's unlikely that Russia or any other member is going to stand in the way of the required measures, such as sending human rights monitors, sending peacekeeping forces, setting up mechanisms to protect civilians, or even getting the United Nations humanitarian agencies present on the ground, which they are not at the moment. The UN up to now has been a really dismal failure.
Kholood, in terms of the UN, there was actually an effort to get a resolution at the end of November to protect civilians, or call for the protection of civilians, that specifically mentioned Darfur and the siege of al-Fasher. Russia used its veto, and many who covered that say that behind the scenes, Russia did that as a response to the authorization to use long-range missiles by Ukraine into Russian territory. As a Sudanese, what do you think of that sort of trading of different files on different conflicts and the response of Russia?
I think it's abysmal that, Russia would try to block something on the protection of civilians, and the kinds of things that, at the Security Council should be, sort of politics free. But the current geostrategic environment means that, unfortunately, Sudan, like Palestine, is falling prey to all of these different machinations by international global powers. What I think is also interesting is it's not just as far as everybody was concerned, Russia was going to abstain. So the long-range missiles in Ukraine played one part of it. Another version of events that I believe, frankly, is that the acting Sudanese Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ali Yusuf, got in touch with the Russians and asked them to veto because he felt that he was not properly consulted by the United Kingdom as the penholder and as the president in November. Now, I think this just shows the extent to which the people of Sudan are effectively being sacrificed at the altar of many egos, both those of domestic actors like the acting Minister of Foreign Affairs or the de facto minister, as well as then the sort of international competition between Russia and the United States, or Russia and the West more broadly. We have to remember here that when it comes to the issue of protection, we must de-link it from ceasefire. And one of the things that this resolution did, unfortunately, was directly link protection to ceasefire. It was mostly, if we look at the draft, about a compliance mechanism for the Jeddah Agreement signed some 18 months ago, that specifically looks at not the protection of civilians, but a ceasefire. We have to de-link those things. We have to de-link humanitarian aid also from a ceasefire. Aid and protection of civilians should not be reliant on a ceasefire that, frankly, is not coming anytime soon.
OK, to find out more about a conflict, it's often worth following the money. And as the conflict ranges this one and people starve, a gold rush is underway. The violence has interrupted operations at many mines, but despite production cuts, the precious metal still accounts for 40% of Sudan's export revenue. Even before the conflict began, the Rapid Support Forces controlled most of the gold sector. Now, UN investigators say the paramilitary group is using the proceeds from the gold mining to arm its fighters. A confidential report submitted to the UN Security Council in November found that gold worth $860 million had been extracted from paramilitary-controlled mines in Darfur this year. Dallia, how much of a role does gold play in this conflict?
The fact that the smuggling of gold never stopped since the start of the war is very telling. It is the main source of finance for the RSF, and it's also it's a good source for their allies who utilize, the money from the gold smuggling. Where is it banked? Like you said, follow the money trail. And, and it's not just the UAE in this case, it's also the case of Russia. Russia has also benefited from the gold smuggling that's from Sudan. And as long as there's no sanctions on those who, gold has never been brought up as an issue that needs to be sanctioned or needs to be, investigated, but it's the main source of income for the RSF. The RSF is a very rich, very well entrenched entity in Sudan in regards to the economy. And that gold is one of their main sources. But it always finds a way to get out. It always finds a way for it to be smuggled out, and nothing has been done about it. And like I said, it's been going on since before the war even erupted. So it's not something new.
And Alex, this is just part. Sorry, Kholood, go ahead.
I could just add, there was a recent, very long New York Times article that really went into details about this. And what it shows very clearly is that it's not just the Rapid Support Forces that are, getting money from the gold trade through the United Arab Emirates. It is also the Sudanese Armed Forces. And what we have to remember here is that when you have an actor like the UAE, which has never wanted democracy in Sudan, it really sees no problem in having financial relationships with the different armed actors that are also not in favor of democratic transformation transition in Sudan, in which case we see here a much more complex picture than what is often said about how the different actors in Sudan, the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces, are accessing money internationally. The UAE has become a hub. It's become sort of a bank for all the malign actors in Africa, and the Sudanese armed forces is not an exception. What I think we need to look at then is international mechanisms that curb not just sort of, the different actors that we don't like, but all actors that are able to benefit from some of the grey economies, particularly around gold, that keep wars like this going.
It's worth, when you mentioned the UAE, showing perhaps this, which we showed at the beginning in our report, which is a letter to a senator from the White House, and it's about the United Arab Emirates and their role. And it says the UAE has informed the administration it will not now be transferring any weapons to the RSF and will not be doing so going forward. Alex, what do you make of this? I mean, is this proof that they were doing it all along? And do you trust the assurances from the Biden administration, with just a few weeks to go, that they're confident about this?
Yes, it is indeed an assurance, an affirmation that actually the UAE has been doing this kind of illicit provision of arms that has been inflaming the war. I would take any assurances from the US administration, both the Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration, which has said nothing on this topic thus far, or the UAE. I would take those with a very strong pinch of salt. We really don't know what this adds up to. And even if arms supplies were to stop, financial support may continue. It may. There are many other ways of getting arms to the RSF and indeed to the other side, to SAF, that don't require direct arms transfers from the UAE or from anyone else. I think what this points to is the way that the Sudanese war has become embedded within the geopolitics and the financial politics, including the sort of the illicit war economies of the Middle East, pointing to the fact that I think has been very clear to many of us for several years, that the route to a resolution of Sudan runs through the Arab capitals, notably Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, and Cairo. And it is in the context of the very tough political bargaining of the Middle East that there will be the prospect of making progress to resolving the crisis in Sudan.
So, Dallia, let me ask you about that, prospects for diplomacy. If you look so far, there have been very fragmented diplomatic efforts involving the African Union, the regional grouping IGAD, the Saudi Arabia working with the US, meetings arranged by Egypt, the so-called Troika, the US, the UK and Norway, the UN with a personal envoy of the Secretary General. Do you see anything that is going to get diplomacy working here?
No, I don't. I have very little hopes of the diplomatic push bringing an end to this war, simply because neither side is willing nor wants to find the diplomatic resolution to this war. I think the only way there will be some kind of ending is if one side is victorious. Neither side will give up or give in to the other. And if that is to happen, then how can these two entities end up, working together, so to speak, for Sudan? And so that's not the case. And like we've already been seeing, there's been talk, there's been reports of their government in exile being proclaimed. And that is just a way for the RSF to seek legitimacy along with its supporters within the Sudanese political sphere. So I don't think diplomacy has failed. There's never been a serious push from any side or any actor to bring these two sides to the table and to find a resolution to this war. So I don't think diplomacy will do anything at all. That's my opinion anyway. But it's a very pessimistic view.
Kholood, we're hearing a last-minute diplomatic push from the United States. And, of course, there was that Security Council meeting. They are the current president of the UN Security Council. But is this final dying lame duck days of the administration, is it too little, much too late?
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. The US has, to give them their dues, they have worked on trying to, for example, improve the humanitarian access constraints. They have tried to host high-level meetings to bring in the two different sides, the two main belligerent sides, the SAF and the RSF. But if you want to have an impact on a conflict, you need to put leverage on the table. And nobody, chiefly the US, wants to put leverage on the table. You mentioned the letter by the White House official Brett McGurk responding to Senator Van Hollen. Within that letter, it was 3 or 4 paragraphs. An entire paragraph was dedicated to the UAE's role in Gaza rather than the UAE's role in Sudan. That just shows you where the administration's priorities are. More importantly, they don't want Congress to rock the boat with the UAE. The UAE is not just a signatory to the Abraham Accords, which again was Trump's sort of main foreign policy sort of gambit. It was a chief architect of the Abraham Accords, and in many ways it wants that kind of status, that Teflon status that Israel has with Washington, and it has managed to engineer a way in which it will effectively not be held to account. Now, other countries will also want that kind of status in the region, and all this leaves Sudan very, very much far behind. I don't think Sudan is anywhere near the top of any kind of international agenda for the United States, even as people working within the administration recognize what the effects of the overspill will be and how much a state collapse in Sudan will affect the region, the Sahel, the Red Sea region, the Horn of Africa. So we have this asymmetry of different prioritizations within the administration. We don't have a clear trajectory of what they want to do, and therefore we're not really going to see anything. I don't think Trump will have anything more workable than that.
Alex, very quickly, there is some talk in these final month, the final month of the Biden administration, that they might designate the situation a genocide. Very quickly, would that help?
I think it would certainly push it up the international agenda. The International Criminal Court still has a mandate, and the prosecutor is investigating. It would, I think, however, chiefly be a symbolic act, a gesture really of despair, the fact that the Biden administration has not succeeded in properly tackling this crisis. It would be a parting shot to say there's something truly terrible happening here that we have failed to redress.
A totally horrendous situation, but thank you so much for joining us to discuss things on today's Inside Story. Our guests were Dallia Abdelmoniem, Alex de Waal and Kholood Khair. Remember, we bring you the Inside Story here every day of the year. Watch us on television, on our app or on aljazeera.com. What should we discuss next time? Post your comments and suggestions on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. On X, our username is @AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, and the production team here in Doha. Please stay safe. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.